And next, I will introduce our keynote speaker. Kevin is one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota, which is identifying and mapping racially restrictive housing covenants in the 20th century. Combining GIS, optical character recognition, and crowdsourcing, Mapping Prejudice weaves traditional research methodologies with cutting-edge digital tools to build comprehensive spatial databases of racial covenants for cities across the United States. An active proponent of the digital humanities, Kevin's work focuses on the intersection of race, historical narrative, and contested space. In addition to his geospatial research, Kevin is also the lead web developer for the Minneapolis project. He holds a master's in geographic information science and has developed multiple online applications for the University of Minnesota, Prologue DC, and Visible City. You can find some of his cartographic work in the Star Tribune, Open Rivers, and the Middle West Review. Kevin will discuss the Mapping Prejudice Project today, which is a team of activists and scholars who show how contemporary urban geography has been shaped by historic restrictions on property ownership. Using digital technology, they are assembling the first ever spatial database of racial covenants for an American city. Their project maps restrictive deed covenants and agreements made during home purchases that enforced racial segregation until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed such covenants. Despite this landmark legislation, to this day, the vast majority of the nation's neighborhoods do remain deeply segregated. Racial covenants help explain why. When I first began the search for keynote speakers, Kevin's name came up multiple times, and from different sources too. I believe this to be a sign of great work being done. I am very excited and honored to introduce today's keynote speaker, Kevin Ehrman-Solberg. All right, on to you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Carmen. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm going to try to just share the screen now, so if there's a technical difficulty, we'll get that out of the way. Let's see here. All right, is that looking all right?
Looks great.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction and the kind words. Excited to be here to share some of what we're doing here at the University of Minnesota. Other side of the river, I know, but the thing about racial covenants is this is certainly not a Minneapolis or Minnesota specific thing. It is worth noting that when we started this project about 5 years ago now, we were almost exclusively focused on Minneapolis. We've since expanded to the 7-county metro, just kind of in the Twin Cities area. And we are in preliminary discussions with Milwaukee, Omaha in Nebraska, Reno, and Essex County north of Boston. So a lot of what I'm talking about today, we are kind of in this interesting pivot moment in our project where we're attempting to bring this methodology to replicate this work in other communities across the United States. Before I get too deep into what racial covenants are and some of the things that we found about them, I think it's a useful place to start is with some historical context. And the place that I usually start is with a story, and it's not my story. It's a story of the Simpson family. In 1909, W.H. Simpson and his wife Daisy, a Black family, moved into the Prospect Park neighborhood of Minneapolis, which is kind of historically one of the upper middle class neighborhoods of the city. It's very close actually to the University of Minnesota campus where I work. When they purchased their lot, they were almost immediately confronted by a mob of white people. It was about 120 strong. They confronted the Simpson family and told them directly, and this is a quote, that they would use any means necessary to secure the Simpsons' removal. This confrontation, the Minneapolis Tribune at the time referred to it as a race war. It failed to kind of terrorize the Simpsons into submission. They stuck it out, and this white mob was doing all sorts of things. They tried to buy them out. When that failed, they tried to block construction. They would block the fire hydrants, so the stonemasons couldn't actually get water to mix the mortar. There were all these kind of different things that this ad hoc organization of racist white neighbors kind of tried to do to force the Simpsons out, and those efforts failed. The Simpsons did continue to kind of hang on and live in that neighborhood, which I think is an important story of resilience. I don't want to get caught kind of subsumed in this larger narrative. But this confrontation marks a pretty profound turning point in the history of Minneapolis. And I think moments like this, you can pretty easily map this onto pretty much any kind of large northern urbanized industrialized city. in the early 20th century. And when the Simpsons moved into Prospect Park, the demographic picture of Minneapolis is very different from what it looks like today. This is a choropleth map that I built using enumeration district data, so raw census return stuff from IPUMS. Darker shaded area, higher percentage of African Americans. The numbers you see overlaid is the raw total of Black families, or Black individuals, I should say, in that enumeration district. And in 1910, Minneapolis is not a particularly segregated city. The area with the highest concentration of African Americans, it's near North Minneapolis, kind of in the center of the map here. And it's only about 20% African American. And in addition to that, there are these emergent Black communities sprinkled throughout the entire city, including Northeast Minneapolis on the east side of the river, and South Minneapolis down by Lake Harriet and Lake Nokomis, which are some of the richest and whitest neighborhoods of the city today. So this is the demographic picture of when the Simpsons tried to move into that Prospect Park neighborhood. But just 30 years later, that picture looks pretty radically different, right? Those emergent Black communities, those small ones, like in Northeast Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, are completely gone. By 1940, there is no census district in Northeast Minneapolis containing multiple Black families. By 1940, there is no census district south of about 45th Street containing multiple Black families. And for the first time in the city's history, we have majority minority neighborhoods. And you see the two of them here near North Minneapolis, and then the old South Side, which is pretty much right at the border of where George Floyd was murdered earlier this year. So again, some of these historical racial boundaries are still very kind of real and very salient to the racial geography of the city today. But this all begs the question, right, of what happened, like what's going on in this 30-year period where you have a city that's kind of going in one direction on a fairly racially integrated path. And then there's kind of this pivot towards this much more rigidly defined segregated space. And there are a lot of things going on kind of during this period. And I want to go over some of the big ones. The first is kind of this discursive shift in how people are conceptualizing space, value, neighborhoods, and race. In geography, the discipline that I'm in, we often talk about this as the racialization of space, which is essentially embedding certain ideas about quality to a landscape. In this case, kind of we're at the neighborhood level, and kind of tying that to the racial category of those who live there. So it's this idea that the quality of space, the quality of a neighborhood, the quality of housing means or has something to do with the racial category of the people who are living in that neighborhood, who are living in that environment. And this sort of thinking, I think we've all kind of encountered this or are familiar with it, but I think it's worth pointing out that this is a fairly new idea. This is a 20th century invention. The way that race worked, historically, certainly like in the 19th century, wasn't necessarily in the same way, which isn't to say that racism didn't exist. Of course it did. But this particular modality of racism, this idea that neighborhoods should be racially monolithic and they need to be racially monolithic in order for them to be stable, that's that's a new idea. And it's an idea that really spreads across the country like wildfire. In the first half of the 20th century. This is kind of the headwind that the Simpson family ran into when they tried to buy that home in Prospect Park. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Like whenever there's a big discursive shift, like kind of at this scale, it takes work to convince people that, yeah, this is how we should be thinking about cities. This is the new way of urban planning, right? And I'm going to go over kind of a couple of the big, I would say, national developments in this. And one of them is the formation of the National Association of Real Estate Boards. This is the first national in scope professional organization of realtors. And honestly, the profession of realtors is also kind of a 20th century phenomenon. That wasn't really as much of a thing in the 19th century. And like all professional organizations, when the NAREB was formed, they came up with a code of ethics. And right in the ethics manual, they're very explicit about kind of incorporating this racialized spatial thinking. Article 34 reads that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So one of the reasons I read this is a very good kind of explicit example of this linkage that I'm talking about. The racial category has to do with property values. That's the connection that's they're attempting to make here, which is kind of a weird one if you think about it, right? Like the racial category of one who lives in an area doesn't tell you anything about their income, whether or not their homeowner status, what kind of neighbors they are, right? Like it doesn't have anything to do with that. But this racialization of space is happening. It's being propagated by entities like the NAREB, who are really codifying and institutionalizing this way of thinking. About 20 years later, the formation of the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, they're pulling that exact same move, where in their underwriting manuals, this is the guide that the FHA uses when they try to determine if somebody is eligible or ineligible for an FHA loan. They explicitly encourage the use of racial covenants to prevent, in their word, the mixing of inharmonious racial groups. And that they go on to say that deed covenants are effective in protecting neighborhoods from, again, to use their language, adverse influences. So kind of reading the FHA is essentially saying that the introduction of people who aren't white into a neighborhood, that's an adverse influence on that neighborhood's property values. And as such, should be prevented. And racial covenants, according to the FHA, is a great tool in facilitating that process. This is another example of coupling kind of racial category of occupancy with perceived value of that neighborhood. So those are kind of some of the big national picture things that are going on. But what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is we are kind of, we're building a spatial database of the specific mode of racial discrimination called racial covenants. I think the best way to introduce those is to read some examples of covenants that we found. And they say things like, no persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. I think it's worth noting too, this particular covenant is from 1946. So this was written after World War II and after the Holocaust. Neither shall said property be transferred or leased to a colored person. The area one. There are additional types of restrictions too. The ones that I just read, those are deed restrictions. Those show up in warranty deeds, the documents that are issued when property is sold. But you also find them in plat restriction or in plat documents as well. So when an area becomes subdivided, occasionally they will put in the racial covenant, which would subsequently apply to any lot in that plat. This isn't super common in Minnesota, but we've done some preliminary work in Colorado, and they found hundreds of these. So very few deed covenants there, but quite a few of these plat restrictions. Another way that these restrictions get recorded is in petition documents. We haven't found any of those in the Midwest, or not the Midwest, but in Minnesota so far, but some work that we've done in Washington, DC, that's actually very common. A petition restriction, meaning that rather than a developer kind of adding one of these restrictions to land as it's subdivided, neighbors who already live in that neighborhood get together and file one of these restrictions. So there are a bunch of kind of like different types of property documents that can contain a racial covenant. But they all effectively do the same thing. They restrict the ability for anybody to own or occupy that particular parcel unless they meet these racial characteristics. It's also important to note just how powerful it is when you add a covenant to something like a plat or a warranty deed. The reason being, with the way that property law works in the United States, when you add a covenant to a document like a warranty deed, that restriction tracks with the land and not the individual owner or resident, which is weird. You can't do this really with any other type of contract, but you can with property. And what that means in practice, say if in 1910 I bought a house, threw a racial covenant on it, 5 years later I sell it to a white person. 5 years after that, they sell it to a white person. 5 years after that, they try to sell it to somebody who isn't white. This is multiple sales down the line, right? I had no idea really even who this seller is because the house has been transferred multiple times. But that person is still breaching the terms of the racial covenant. And I would have legal standing as the initial granting party, the person who first added that covenant into the property record. I would have legal standing to sue this person. And there are a lot of cases like this throughout the United States where this is exactly what happened. Where, several generations down the line, somebody tries to sell a covenanted property to somebody who isn't white and they get sued. They lose the house, any equity they've accumulated, and the property reverts to the initial granting party, the person who first added that racial covenant in. In fact, the only way to get rid of a racial covenant is to find the initial granting party and or their legal heirs or assigns and get them to file an addendum removing the covenant from the parcel. So racial covenants are insanely powerful. Once they're added into the property record, they're effectively there forever. In fact, it took multiple Supreme Court rulings, notably Shelley v. Kramer in 48. There were a few more in the 50s, combined with state and federal legislation to finally make racial covenants illegal. But it's also worth noting that even though they're illegal now, you can still find them. If you pull the title record on a home, certainly in a place like Minneapolis, if the home was built prior to 1950 or so, and after 1910, high likelihood that it contains a racial covenant. So what I want to do now is give an idea of the extent of these restrictions. So this is a time-lapse map that I made showing the spread of racial covenants through Minneapolis and the rest of Hennepin County through time. If you look at the top right, you'll see the cumulative count as well as the, lets you know kind of what year we're in. A couple kind of things to note about this map. For one thing, the data is a little bit out. This is a little bit old. I have to update this. We've mapped a total of about 25,000 racial covenants in Hennepin County, and I think this one caps out in the low around 20 or 21,000. The other thing I should point out is that, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but based on our methodology, it's highly likely we missed some covenants. So we use optical character recognition, but the kind of efficacy of that is conditionally dependent on the quality of the source material. And in some cases, when you're dealing with these old property records, it's not very good. So if anything, this is underestimating the total amount of racially restricted land in Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs. But even with that caveat, you can see how some of these things just completely envelop entire sections of the city, entire sections of the suburb. You can see Edina, which is one of the wealthier suburbs of Minneapolis, kind of on the left part of the screen there, is just kind of taken over by these things in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I want to talk a little bit about how we're building this map and building this database. So the thing about racial covenants is historians, geographers, sociologists, legal historians have known about the presence of racial covenants for a really long time. These figure actually quite prominently in some of the NAACP's early work. This was one of the big things they were fighting against, which culminated in a favorable Supreme Court ruling in Shelley v. Kramer in 48, which made it harder to legally enforce racial covenants. But nobody really has any idea the precise spatial extent of these restrictions. We know they were used, we know they were kind of encouraged by these national entities like the FHA, like the NAREB, but we don't know much about their total spatial extent. We don't know much about when they started, which neighborhoods were covered, which neighborhoods were not covered. And the reason for that is finding racial covenants is challenging. The only place that they exist are in these property records and warranty deeds. To put the kind of scope of the problem in scale for just Hennepin County, which isn't by any means the largest county in the country, there are about 3 million deed images that were recorded between 1900 and 1968. That's the period that we're interested in. I did some back of the envelope math. If I just read deeds for 40 hours a week, it would take me over 2 decades just to get through the entirety of the record. And that's not even mentioning how much time it would take to map anything that we found. So the reason nobody has really kind of done this at this scale before isn't so much that we've come up with this, we have unearthed this kind of particular mechanism of segregation that nobody has thought about before, but rather the technical hurdles to identifying, mapping, and spatializing this historical data are really, really challenging. The first thing that we do is we use optical character recognition to try to identify documents that contain racial language. So those 3 million images, they all get pushed through the Google TestDirect OCR engine, and we have a whole kind of host of Python scripts that help with automated image pre-processing so we can get better reads. And I don't need to get too kind of into the technical weeds there, but the short version is this allows us to narrow down these millions of historic documents, these historic scans, into the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever the number is, kind of subset of records that likely contain some racial language. So that's kind of step one, is narrowing down the scope of the problem. Step 2 is extracting relevant information from that kind of subset of deeds. And to do that, we use an online crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. This platform was co-developed at the University of Minnesota and Oxford in England, and it's designed for kind of big data projects that can't be fully automated. So how we incorporate this project is whenever we get a hit through OCR, it uploads that image to Zooniverse, where volunteers are asked a set of questions, a standardized set of questions about each flagged image. So we ask, is there actually a racial covenant? We get false matches. We're looking for words like white. We'll look for words like race. Those often indicate a racial covenant, but sometimes someone's named Richard White, so we get a flag. Or sometimes Horace, which contains the word race, that can trigger a false match. So the first thing we ask volunteers is there a racial covenant? If so, transcribe it, and then we ask them some additional questions as well, mostly about spatial identifier characteristics. So we ask for the edition name, the lot number, the block number, things like that. Each deed has to be looked at by 5 unique volunteers. And then on the back end, we have a set of scripts that I wrote that lean pretty heavily on this statistic called the Cohen's-Kappa statistic, which measures agreement overlap. I don't need to get too in the weeds here, but essentially this is a way to figure out if a user is agreeing with the majority of other users most of the time, or if they're over here kind of doing their own thing when we ask them to classify these documents. And this allows us to get a ranked score that indicates kind of who's good at, who's doing a thoughtful job, and who's kind of either confused, doesn't understand the instructions, or just kind of going through the motions. We use that to call out bad data values. Whatever's left for a document, we then calculate the modal value. So if, say, 5 people look at document 1, there is a racial covenant, 4 people say, or 4 people have good scores, 1 person has bad score, we throw that 1 person out. Of the 4 remaining, if 3 people say, it's lot 1, and 1 person says it's lot 10, we keep the lot 1 value. If there's a tie during that modal process, we keep the value of the user in that subset who has the highest weighted Cohen's-Kappa score. So this is how we kind of ensure data accuracy as we go through this online transcription process. I want to talk a little bit too about why we're doing it this way. In a lot of ways, it would probably, frankly, be more efficient if we just hired a bunch of undergrads and had them kind of crank these deeds out. Doing all of this through Zooniverse has a host of challenges, but one of the things that we kind of figured out early on is that by encouraging community members to be a part of this research project, that does a couple things. For one, we have heard over and over and over again, and this is self-reported by many of our thousands and thousands of volunteers, that the act of reading these deeds made their relationship to structural racism feel more real. That rather than this being this kind of broad statistical thing, it becomes a personal thing, because you're looking at warranty deeds and you're like, oh my God, this is the neighborhood that my grandparents lived in, or this is the neighborhood that I live in right now, or this is on the same block that I live on, this restriction. So the act of doing the research, kind of the praxis of the research, in some ways is as important, if not more so, than the data that comes out of this. I think the data that comes out of this is incredibly important, and I'll talk more about that and kind of what that shows later. But I do always like to take a moment to say that the reason we're doing this kind of online engaged crowdsourcing protocol isn't just because it's the most efficient way to collect data, but rather that by engaging community stakeholders, it raises the visibility of our project. It kind of creates a shared resource instead of this sort of isolated thing that the University of Minnesota is doing. And it's also just a powerful tool in building political will for meaningful change around racism in our experience. The final thing, kind of in the 3 big steps of our project, right? OCR narrows it down, Zooniverse and crowdsourcing, that's how we encode the data. The third part is the actual GIS work. And I'm embarrassed to say our GIS work is very rudimentary. Most of kind of the stuff we're doing that's unique tends to be on the OCR and Zooniverse side of things. The GIS is a bit more nuts and bolts. Essentially, what we're trying to do is match contemporary parcels data with historic spatial signifiers. So we concatenate the legal address, which contains an edition name, a block number, and a lot number. And we try to join that with contemporary stuff that also shares that kind of unique ID, that unique concatenation of addition, block, and lot. The obvious problem here is, well, what happens when the historic addition, block, and lot no longer exists? What if that lot was paved over with a freeway or subsequently subdivided or whatever the case may be? That's about, I would say, a third of the parcels in Hennepin County had that issue. Those we have to draw manually. So we georeference the historic plat maps. We draw those historic lots in, assign them the attributable values of what their initial addition, block, and lot values were, and then we're able to kind of join that back to the stuff that comes out of Zoom. So that's kind of how we spatialize all of this. It can be somewhat tedious, especially working with these lot boundaries that just aren't reflected in any contemporary parcels data. But it's this is the joy of trying to map stuff that was recorded 100 years ago, right? You just got to deal with the hand that you're dealt. So that's kind of how we're doing this and how we're approaching this problem, and why we've been able to kind of identify covenants and map them at a scale that no other project has ever really been able to do. I want to talk now a little bit about how covenants work and what they're doing during this historical period. And the first thing that's worth exploring a little bit is how these covenants are actually being embedded into the property record. And one of the things we found very early on, and it'll be interesting as we expand our work across the country and start doing other cities, kind of what those results show. Because in Minneapolis, the vast majority, I'm estimating here, or this is strictly from memory, it's over 90% of all racial covenants were put into place by developers. So what's happening kind of during this period is land that was agricultural. So this is the perimeter of Minneapolis, as well as almost all of the suburbs. And if you remember, the first covenant in Minneapolis was in 1910. And then they kind of spread from there. And the picture of the city in 1910 is a rapidly growing city. This is kind of the Minneapolis boom period. So as this agricultural land is getting bought up by developers and subdivided into individual municipal lots, that's when the racial covenant is being kind of injected into the title record. This is an example of that. This particular edition, the Delphine Heights edition, this is a brochure they mailed out. In the brochure, they actually brag about the racial covenants, new, beautiful, highly restricted residential sites. And we all know what restricted means in this case, right? Like the entire edition did contain a racial covenant. Other developers are even more explicit. This particular one, it's in the Uptown neighborhood, Lake of the Isles neighborhood of Minneapolis. They took out a full-page ad in the Minneapolis Tribune. And right in the middle of the full-page ad, they have the language of the racial restriction. And you can read it. So these real estate companies, these developers, they are actively promoting racial covenants. This isn't so much like a dirty little secret. They're bragging about these things. And this has to do with those linkages I was talking about earlier between perceived quality of space and the racial category of those who occupy that space. These developers are feeding into that fear. They're leveraging that fear as a promotional tool. They're telling people pretty explicitly that, hey, not only do we have this great new addition with great new homes, we have taken steps to ensure that this area will be white forever. So you can feel safe with your investment. This is the kind of language that these developers are using. It's all about protecting home values. That's kind of the language that comes up over and over again. One of the things that this means is because developers are at the forefront of this, we don't see very many covenants in older neighborhoods in Minneapolis. For example, the Prospect Park neighborhood, where at the beginning I mentioned the Simpsons family's kind of experience with that white mob there. Prospect Park doesn't have covenants, primarily because it had been completely developed by 1909, when the Simpsons tried to move in. The places we find covenants are the places where the most development was happening during this period, roughly 1910 through the 1950s. And what that means is that land is getting kind of preemptively racially restricted before anybody even really lives there. This particular image that you're looking at, this is an aerial photograph from the 1930s taken in South Minneapolis by about 60th and Cedar, if you're familiar with the area at all. And each one of these red rectangles is a lot that had been racially restricted prior to this photograph being taken. So as you can see, land is being racially restricted. It's being held for the exclusive use of white people before any development even happens. Land's being restricted before the roads go in, before the utilities are connected, long before anybody builds an actual house there. In some cases, before even like the rest of the utilities grid, like sewer lines, are connected to that area. The first thing that developers are doing during this period is racially restricting land. And what this means is that as Minneapolis expands during this period, and this exact same process is happening in the suburbs, as that expansion happens, all of that new housing is reserved from the outset for the exclusive use of white people. If you aren't white, you do not get to participate in the property market of new construction, essentially. For about the first half of the 20th century, covenants were in play here for a pretty long time, and this surprisingly had huge impact on homeownership rates. The other thing that's going on during this period is redlining. And I think in a lot of ways, people are more familiar with the concept of redlining rather than racial covenants. But I think it's worth a couple minutes of exploration here in how redlining and racial covenants are kind of reinforcing each other. So the map that you're looking at right now, this is the official redlining map for Minneapolis. It was commissioned by Holk, the Homeowners and Loan Corporation. It's a federal New Deal program in the 1930s. And Holk commissioned these maps for about 100 cities across the United States. And they broke these cities up into 4 categories that are color-coded, hence the term redlining. The green areas, according to Holk, are the best. Blue are considered still desirable. Yellow are considered definitely declining, and red are considered hazardous. Unsurprisingly, areas that are considered hazardous often are the neighborhoods where non-white people live. For this particular map, there's actually a set of narrative descriptions that explains why every single area got the category that it got. And there are 2 neighborhoods in two neighborhoods in Minneapolis that have explicit kind of racialized language in them. One area, a D7 on this map, I don't know if you can see it, but it's kind of that, there's like kind of in the middle, there's that skinny bastion of red kind of going down Chicago. And that was redlined, according to the people who made this map, according to Holk, due to, and I'm quoting here, the quote, gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. That's the terminology that Holk was using. So that land was considered hazardous, not because of any inherent characteristics of that land. They don't say anything about the quality of homes or how well connected it is to the transit lines or anything like that. They say simply because people who aren't white have been, and again, to use their language, infiltrating this area. That by itself is enough to give it a hazardous ranking. So this is kind of another example, again, of these linkages between quality of space or perceived quality of space and the racial category of those who live in that area. And what this means in practice is if an area gets redlined, it's going to be pretty much impossible for you to get a mortgage, to get a loan to purchase a home in that area. So the relationship between redlining and covenants, it's kind of like 2 sides of the same coin, and it creates really brutal conditions for anybody who isn't white and who is trying to buy a house. The map on the left, each one of those black dots denotes a black family in 1940, which is roughly the year this redlining map was created. I've extracted on the left the 2 bad grades, yellow and red, the declining and hazardous grades. And then the map on the right, blue and green, those are the good grades. I put them in relation to where racial covenants were. So kind of you can see how these 2 things fit together, right? Areas where Black people are already living get redlined. It's not the only reason a neighborhood gets redlined. If you look at Northeast Minneapolis, a lot of the stuff up there was redlined because it was heavy industrial. But every place where Black people do live in any significant numbers do get redlined by Holk. And this kind of line of thinking gets subsumed into the FHA when they kind of take on Holk in the early 1940s. And then, of course, on the right, areas with racial covenants get better grades. It's not the only reason, again, why a neighborhood can get a good grade, but every part of the city that had kind of, a significant number of racial covenants gets a favorable grade from Holk. And that line of thinking, again, continues with the FHA. So if you're Black during this period, you're really in a tough spot, right? The kind of central part of the city, that's all been redlined. If you want to buy a house there, you're not going to be able to get a mortgage unless you just have a pile of cash under your mattress. You're going to have a really hard time actually being able to purchase one of those homes. Okay, well then maybe what about the suburbs? What about stuff at the perimeter of the city? Well, those are the areas that have racial covenants. If you're Black, it's illegal for you to own or occupy one of those parcels, one of those pieces of land. So it creates this real nasty 1-2 punch where large swaths of the city can't get a mortgage if you want to buy there. Other swaths of the city where you can get a mortgage, you just can't legally live there because of racial covenants. And it's also worth kind of acknowledging that when Black families are able to surmount these obstacles, when they can find kind of a home that A, isn't redlined, and B, isn't racially restricted, those tend to be the cases where you see evidence of white violence. I talked a little bit about what happened to the Simpson family, but another story about 30 years later, the Jackson family, I think kind of further illustrates this point. Jackson family, very similar to the Simpsons, African-American family, they find a house in South Minneapolis, that's kind of south of where the redlining stops, but north of where the covenants start, kind of that liminal space. And within a few days of moving in, a mob, this time it's over 1,000 strong. If you remember, the Simpson mob was only about 100, 120 people. This one's well over 1,000. They surround the house. They vandalize the house. They start shooting through the windows. They kill the family's dog. The family's daughter, Mary, required a police escort just to get safely to kindergarten because there were threats against her life. It was brutal. And frankly, in my opinion, the only reason this story doesn't end with the Jacksons being kind of murdered is because, excuse me, the homeowner was a World War I veteran, and he called in his army buddies from World War I to form this armed perimeter around the home just to kind of keep this surging white mob at bay. And this story is important, not just because it's evidence of how racism is being operationalized and deployed, but because there's always this threat of white violence whenever these kind of structural mechanisms of segregation fail, right? So when the redlining doesn't work, or when the covenants don't work, when discriminatory lending doesn't work, when the real estate steering that's being encouraged by the NAREB doesn't work, there's always the threat of these white mobs to kind of fill in those gaps. That's exactly what you saw with this family in the 1930s. All right, I want to talk a little bit about some of the impacts of racial covenants and why covenants are salient today, like why this is, I would argue, this is something worth studying. And then hopefully I can leave a few minutes at the end if anybody has any questions. But the way that kind of covenants wound up working in Minneapolis, and I think this pattern plays out everywhere. Again, we won't know until we've mapped more covenants in other geographies. But I don't think this is really anything that I'm saying is unique to Minneapolis. But covenants produced kind of an initial pattern of segregation. And we do know that this is true kind of that writ broadly, northern cities weren't that segregated in the 19th century, that segregation levels steadily increase through the 20th century to the point where many cities today are far more segregated now than they were in, say, the 1880s or the 1890s. And once those kind of concentrations had been created, this allows for a whole host of subsequent mechanisms that are discriminatory. One example is the role that infrastructure projects played in Minneapolis. This map that you're looking at, this is a 1940 Black population, same kind of choropleth map as the earlier ones I showed, but I've overlaid subsequent freeway projects on top of this. And as you can see, every major Black community in Minneapolis had a freeway run through it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Near North Minneapolis, the largest Black community at the time, was almost wiped out by the expansion of 94W and Olson Memorial. Same story along the Hiawatha corridor, same story along 35W, where the new Viking Stadium is today, and same story in South Minneapolis as well. So this kind of this is the reason I'm sure this map is, this is an example of kind of how subsequent urban planning is using these segregated concentrations of non-white populations to kind of enforce these unequal outcomes, right? You can't run a freeway through all the Black communities unless you've done the preliminary work of segregating into existence almost exclusively majority minority communities. And that doesn't just happen by itself, right? As I spent the first half of this presentation talking about, it was the use of covenants, it was the use of all these other mechanisms that create those concentrations. once you have those concentrations, this then opens up the door for these subsequent mechanisms of inequality. It's also worth noting that the homeownership gap, the racial homeownership gap, meaning the difference between the percentage of white people who own a home and the percentage of Black people who own a home, is particularly acute in Minneapolis. In fact, of the 102 largest cities in the country, Minneapolis has the largest gap. It's about 50%, meaning about 75% of white people in Minneapolis own their home, and only about 25% of Black people in Minneapolis own their home. Similar kind of ranking, I could easily do the rest of the presentation just about how bad we are on these racial equality indices, but another kind of example of this is the Educational Equality Index. This measures the performance of Black versus white students, and we're abysmal. We're 98 out of 100. So same kind of story as the homeownership gap. And we can see this reflected when we map contemporary demographic patterns. The city today is 53% white. The areas that were historically racially covenanted are 79% white. So, well over 50 years since covenants have been illegal, but the segregation patterns produced by covenants remain in pretty significant ways, as you're seeing through with this data. Same story if we're talking about home valuation, which in some ways is almost more important than segregation, right? Because it's not just about where people can and cannot live, but it also has to do with people's material conditions, like whose homes are appreciated in value and who's kind of shut out from that process. And some of the economic work that we've done shows that covenanted homes overperform the city median value by about 15%. It's like 14 point, I rounded down here, but it's like 14.8, which equals about 36 grand. If we look at homes in historically redlined neighborhoods, they underperform by 25%, which equates to about $65,000. So two identical homes, and by the way, the craziest thing about these numbers is these hold true when you normalize for every building characteristic that you can. So if you have two identical homes, same square footage, same number of bedrooms, same number of bathrooms, same build year, same general area of the city, the covenanted one still overperforms by about 14%. So this isn't just like a descriptive statistic. I actually I co-authored an article with a couple of economists at the U who were able to kind of do all this crazy econometrics that I can't do, and found that, yes, even when you normalize for every single variable that we possibly can, the mere presence of a covenant still impacts the property value. So these numbers, it's a pretty big swing, right? This simple question of two identical homes your grandparents bought in the 50s, one covenanted, one redlined. The answer to whether you got the covenanted home or the redlined home is worth about $100,000 today. And that kind of material transfer of wealth really matters when we talk intergenerationally, right? Like we inherit wealth from our parents. If our parents or grandparents were able to attain home ownership and subsequently pass on those equity gains, that makes a huge difference in the way in kind of our material conditions today, right? Like the example that I usually give is the project co-founder, who my colleague, Dr. Kristen Delegard, she found out through her work that her grandparents' home had a racial covenant. And when she bought her home in Minneapolis, she was able to use the proceeds from selling her grandparents' home. Her grandparents had passed, sold the house, split it up amongst the kids. And Kirsten's chunk is what she used to buy the house that she lives in today. And that house, A, was racially covenanted, and B, has this overperformance story, right? Where they were able to buy it for relatively cheap in the 1950s, and now it's appreciated at a much higher rate than a lot of the rest of the city, and certainly at a much higher rate than areas that were redlined. So these historical practices are still informing the racial wealth gap today in these very kind of direct ways. And the final thing that I'm going to talk about is just the broader change in the housing market in general. So this map that you're seeing on the left is a historic valuation map. And essentially what it's showing is the deviation from the median for every block in the city as was assessed by the city in 1956. So darker green areas, those are areas that are assessed at a much higher level than the median city block. Darker red areas, those are areas that are assessed at a much lower level than the median or the value of the median block in the city. And 56 is an important date because this was kind of the peak of racial covenants, right? And when racial covenants were in effect, there's actually a pretty strange pattern in Minneapolis where every neighborhood in the city had affordable housing. The only area where everything is way more expensive than the median is downtown Minneapolis. That's that dark green block you see. So along commercial corridors, that wasn't true, but every residential area, including the parts of the city today that are really expensive, like Southwest Minneapolis, had homes that were kind of at the median price, and in some cases even cheaper than that. And this was the terrain when, if you were white in the 1950s, it was a great time to try to buy a house, right? Obviously, these kind of affordable homes in every neighborhoods were, had the catch attached to them that you had to be white in many cases to buy it. Well, what about today? We don't have racial covenants anymore. These explicit mechanisms of segregation are illegal. What does that value picture look like? Well, it looks really different. The vast majority of Minneapolis is either overperforming the city median by more than 50% or underperforming the city median by more than 50%. The only two neighborhoods that still have kind of a heterogeneous mix of more expensive and affordable, it's a small part of South Minneapolis in the Powderhorn neighborhood and a small part of Northeast Minneapolis. Although I've made these maps for kind of every decade, and every year that I map this, those pockets get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we're not quite at a bimodal distribution yet, but we're getting pretty close. We don't have these explicit mechanisms of segregation anymore. It's not that it's illegal for you to buy a home in Southwest Minneapolis if you're not white, but the financial barrier is astronomically higher than it was in the 1950s when a lot of these homes were initially sold. So the conditions of the housing market are so different now than what they were historically. And this helps explain the persistence of the racial wealth gap and the racial homeownership gap. Last thing I'll show, this is just a histogram showing the same data. So this is from 1956. This is the distribution of variation from the median in terms of assessed block value. And it's a pretty good distribution. The highlighted column there is the median. If we look at that for 2018, super different, right? We're not quite at a bimodal distribution, but we're getting there. The amount of housing that's kind of clustered around that median value, it just gets smaller every single year. And is more and more pushed out to these extremes of significant overperformance or significant underperformance. And these are some of the kind of conditions that we need to change in order to undo some of these historic practices and the inequality that they produced. So that's what I have for a formal presentation. If you'd like to learn more about our project, I'd encourage you to go to our website at mappingprejudice.org. There's also instructions on there for how to volunteer if you're interested in reading some of these historic documents and helping us in the process of identifying covenants. So yeah, I wanted to leave a few more minutes for questions. I only left 2. I'm sorry, Carmen.
No problem. Great presentation. Thank you so much for speaking to our group. We greatly appreciate it. I did get a few questions in the chat, and since we have a little bit of time here, I will go ahead and read them. So the first question is, I'm curious about how many deeds have been appealed and further approved to remove the covenant clause. Has there been much progress on this?
So Minnesota passed a law a couple years ago now that allows a current homeowner to kind of file an addendum to their property rejecting the covenant. You still can't remove them. As bizarre as this sounds, you need the initial granting party's legal heirs or assigns to actually get rid of them. Short of that, you would need additional legislation passed that would kind of allow for this to happen. California did try to pass a law that does that. Personally, I don't think that's a super effective use of public resources for a couple reasons. For one thing, it kind of whitewashes the particular ways that housing inequality were produced through racial covenants. Like, we can't show the impacts of racial covenants if we can no longer find them in property records. Secondly, I would personally argue that the resources that would go into a massive project like that would be better served with affordable housing, homeownership programs for lower income, BIPOC populations and things like that. But there is now a state law, again, in Minnesota specifically, that allows a homeowner to at least like write something into their title, kind of rejecting, acknowledging and repudiating the presence of the covenant, although the covenant itself, of course, still shows up in the title if you pull back far enough.
Okay, yeah, great. The next question I got, it says, The next step in undervalued neighborhoods is sometimes gentrification. I'm wondering if you have any insights on this.
Yeah, and the thing about gentrification, it's kind of like this whole, I could talk a lot about this. I think I've kind of arrived at a point where thinking about segregation and racial wealth gap in relation to housing, it's better to think of that as kind of this ongoing process rather than like a teleological endpoint. And gentrification is kind of the circle completing itself, because the neighborhoods that are gentrifying are the neighborhoods that historically were redlined. By redlining them, this ensured that those living there pretty much had to be renters, because you needed a lot of capital to buy into that neighborhood, right? You can't get a loan. So the only people who can really afford to purchase homes in redline neighborhoods are these like big rental companies. So the ones who are now benefiting from these increased home values are the people, the kind of these white capitalists who were exploiting and extracting resources from those neighborhoods for decades when they were deemed as hazardous, and they're now being able to cash out. So it's not like the segregation pattern. It's not like the goal of segregation was like, well, we're going to have a white neighborhood here and a black neighborhood here. We're going to build walls and it's never going to change. It's more about, as ideas of desirability change, who gets to navigate those spaces. So the question of gentrification, I think the way to kind of address that is through increasing Black homeownership. And I think that's the only thing that's going to, it's the only thing that gives you enough capital to be able to kind of resist some of these processes, other than kind of reframing housing rather as long as the United States treats housing as a commodity as opposed to a right. You have to increase home ownership rates. I think that's the only kind of viable mechanism to disrupt some of these kind of continued processes of displacement and disinvestment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. That almost sounds like it could be its own presentation on gentrification.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And just one more question from me, and I'm sure others are wondering, are you looking for volunteers, or if anyone from WLIA would like to get involved? Can we find more information on your website, or should we reach out to you directly?
Yeah, on the website. So at the top nav bar, there's a little get involved button. And if you click that, it has instructions on how to help us build the map. Right now, the deeds that are live on Zooniverse are all from Washington, D.C. But as I mentioned, we're in conversation with the Recorder's Office in Milwaukee. They've agreed to give us the records. We're just trying to kind of finalize how to do the actual extract. It's hard when you're asking for 10 million images or whatever. But we hope to have some Wisconsin stuff up there in the next couple months is our general target on that. So you can also follow us on social media too. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, if you want to just kind of generally kind of stay in the loop.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. This was a great presentation. The comments are in the chat. I don't know if you were paying attention to that, but it was the entire time, people chiming in, giving input on neighborhoods that they're familiar with. But it seems like everyone loved the presentation. Thank you so much for being here. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, that was such a great keynote, very informative, eye-opening, and stunning in ways. But thank you again, Kevin. Sharing my slide here.